You may remember earlier this year the Skype scandal at the Australian Defence Force Academy. A female cadet was filmed having sex with one of her colleagues without her knowledge, and others watched via the online video chat program Skype. The incident prompted 6 separate reviews into Defence Force culture. The report focusing specifically on the Defence Force Academy has now been released, and it's uncovered widespread low-level sexual harassment and other concerning practices. Here to talk about her findings is the Sex Discrimination Commissioner, Elizabeth Broderick. What exactly does low-level sexual harassment constitute?
When we look at that, and particularly at ADFA, it was things like the repeated retelling of sexual stories, offensive jokes, sexist remarks, those types of things, together with people being stared at in a sexual manner. So quite low level in that it doesn't. We weren't about physical touching or abuse, but more about low-level sexual harassment.
And how many women were subject to that low-level harassment?
Well, our survey found that 74% of women said that they had experienced some kind of sex-related or gender-related harassment, and those things were the most predominant ones.
What about more serious incidents? I mentioned that Skype incident earlier. Did you come across any other incidents of that sort of magnitude or nature?
Well, we spoke to many cadets. In fact, we spoke to a quarter of a cadet body. So there were stories that were told to us through the focus groups, through our confidential telephone lines, confidential submissions. And one of the other things is that our survey did actually find that 2.1% of women had experienced sexual assault in the previous 12 months. So there were some isolated incidents of sexual assault. I mean, the positive thing was that since the mid-90s, when the last review, and that was an internal review that was done, the Grey Review, what we found was that there had been an improvement. And not only in the number of sexual misconduct, but very much so in the tolerance for sexual misconduct. Yeah.
At your press conference today, you said that for most women, most of the time, ADFA is a safe and rewarding place. What does it say about defence culture that we think, well, that's an improvement? If I said to you at the ABC, for most women, most of the time, it's a safe place, we would be horrified.
Well, it is an improvement, and I think, though, you're absolutely right, we still have a way to go, and that's why I think implementing the recommendations in our report expeditiously is a really important thing, because once the recommendations, including things like increasing the level of supervision after hours, they're really important recommendations which speak to women's safety.
Oh, sorry to interrupt you. Speaking of the after-hours thing, a former female cadet told you that female cadets were considered game after dark. What did she mean by that?
Well, some cadets told us that women were objectified, that they were seen as sexual objects. Now, that was actually a divergent view. The predominant view was that women were treated well at ADFA, and I want to faithfully report what the cadet body told me. But having said that, we were keen to hear all the voices, Lee, and that was one that spoke to us about the fact that there is lack of supervision after hours, and that with that there can be tricky situations, and I think that is a significant risk for ADFA and, of course, for women and others.
What sort of a role does alcohol play in the culture, and what recommendations did you make about that?
There is a drinking culture at ADFA. I mean, it's an intense environment. You've got 1,100 cadets between the ages of 17 and 23. They work together, they study together, they live together, and they socialise together. So there is a drinking culture, and in some pockets there's binge drinking as well. When we looked particularly at the cost of drinks in the mess, we found that they were very cheap, particularly in relation to buying at some other establishment. So we recommended that ADFA should review the cost of drinks, but also they should continue with a policy that they have around alcohol testing of cadets. And
is the drinking culture there any different? I mean, we hear often about binge drinking in the broader culture. Is it any different to what you would see elsewhere in the similar age group, 17 to 21?
We don't really have the data to compare it to that, but what I would say is that, cadets at ADFA are held to a higher standard than the general community. And the fact is they are the future leaders of a Defence Force. They are our officers. Not only that, they're being paid. And I think that's one of the interesting things as well. Many of the cadets have quite a high discretionary spend. So they're paid between about $35,000 and $50,000 a year at ADFA. So that probably exacerbates the problem.
One of the things that stood out to me reading the report is that even though the female cadets only take up about a fifth of the population, that they account for about a third of the injuries at ADFA. How do you explain that?
You're right, and that's one of the things that we've made a recommendation about to ADFA, and that is to actually delve into that and try and understand why that is. Because one of the things that flows from that is that when you're injured, you are stigmatised. And I think to the extent that there are more women that are injured proportionally, then they're likely to be stigmatised to a greater degree. So we recommended that ADFA have a good look at that and put in place strategies, firstly to ensure that doesn't occur, but also to the extent that it does, so that these cadets are not stigmatised in the way that they might currently be.
How confident are you that the recommendations that you've made will be acted upon and that somebody else won't be replicating this work in 10 years' time?
I am confident. Part of the reason for that is that within our terms of reference are that within 12 months after the tabling of report, there will be an independent audit to see, firstly, whether the recommendations have been implemented and secondly, how effective they are. So I am confident about that.
Elizabeth Broderick, you promised us when you started this investigation that you would come in and talk to us when it was ready. So thank you very much for honouring that tonight.
Thanks very much, Lee.